at Oh Look It's Wheels. Or more importantly, for this anyway, more importantly, I am making games. So I've been a TTRPG designer for not too long, like a couple of years, but outside of actually publishing things, I've been doing it since I was about 16. And the most recent thing that is coming out, the biggest project I've ever done really, is called The House Doesn't Always Win. It is a game of Risk and Revolution, which uses a standard deck of playing cards to simulate a great period of social change in which characters who have nothing try to take from characters who have everything, and all of the trials and tribulations in between.
Awesome. You know how you mentioned your cat always needs you right as you go live? I have the same thing, except for it's teenagers. No, you can't go away. I'm glad you interrupted my live stream for that. Thanks. I love you.
At least you can talk to yours. I just get a shout, you know. It's just a
right. I get those sometimes also too. So it's not, it's not entirely dissimilar. I know I'm super excited. It's really funny. You reached out to say, hey, I'd love to come on the stream and talk about this, and I was like, oh, you mean this game? And like, I backed the game. I don't know that I actually connected the design with your work, that I was familiar with at all. It just looked like a really great game. I'm super a fan of heisty narrative, especially ones that take like the deck suits on a deck of cards and do fun things with them. There were a lot of things in the game that were touchstones for stuff that I love in games. And I just also thought I loved the way that the art on the project and a lot of other things. So I can't wait to dive into it. But people at one point become game designers. But for a lot of people that actually starts when they're sitting around the table playing. So tell me actually how you got into playing RPGs in the first place, or just what brought you into the RPG community.
Yeah, so I think my story starts like a lot of others where, someone says, hey, do you want to play D&D? I think at the time it was very much because like I was in that sort of friend group where we were super into like, we used to go LARPing, like all that kind of stuff. We loved all that kind of vibe of like telling stories and playing characters. And, I used to do a lot of theater stuff when I was a kid. So it was all very much when someone suggested it, I was like, yeah, of course, I've been wanting to do this for ages. But as I think a lot of people do after a while, although for me it was kind of quick. Like I felt D&D a bit lacking. It was super sort of like a bit too complicated for what I was actually getting out of it. Like there was so much that I had to put in exchange for so little that I felt like I was getting out of it. So after a while, we genuinely just started making our own stuff. Like we'd be like teenagers sitting in a Google Doc and just trying to hash out what we think would be a simpler version, not realizing, that there were 4 million different games that we could be playing that had already done it for us.
Which is, I think, one of the best things. Like it actually, I think, is really to people's benefit to not know what exists out there before you start creating a lot of the time. Like, I think it's actually better to be unaware, because otherwise you go, oh, well, someone's already made that or something kind of like that. And then you hyper focus on like, well, should I create this because it already exists? And that keeps a lot of people from just saying, you just go do it. Like, even if it already exists, you may not be able to publish it, but the process of creating it yourself, you're going to learn things from that. And it's really great to have that sense of freedom that a lot of people, I think, when they're very aware of all the games and then start to get into design, feel overwhelmed by making sure they never step on anyone's toes. And so, I love that kind of freedom. So, so you guys were just kind of designing for yourself. Do you guys remember something that y'all made during that time that you were especially excited about, whether it went anywhere or not, but y'all just thought was amazing?
Yeah. So we had, I think we ended up using, like I think we hacked Gumshoe to make it. But we had this like basically like the whole theme of it was, what if it was a 70s like almost Dukes of Hazzard style cop show but set in space. So it was literally called Space Cops, and it was incredibly dumb. But one thing that we all like, pretty much the only good thing that came out of it was this like character creator we made, which is very much like just a series of roll tables, which were just like stream of consciousness, absolute nonsense for every single, like species you could play as and what kind of classes and stuff like that they had. I think when we actually play it, it fell apart like almost immediately, but it was a lot of fun to just make character creators and stuff like that. I think that spawned a lot of my love for sort of like randomly created tables and things. And like we were talking about Troika earlier. Like one of my favorite things is just rolling up a character in Troika and just marveling at the really thematic little panels of like, here's a character, like, oh, okay, cool, right, let's go. I've always been much more interested in that than just sort of sitting down trying to imagine something generic or whatever.
Which is a good time for me to do my obligatory plug. Troikafest is next week. Actually, Troikafest Jam started today. So if you've ever wanted to step your toes into kind of game design for the first time, or if you're a longtime designer, we've got a thing right now we're doing with Melsonian Arts Council called Troikafest Jam. It's in preparation for next week when we launch Troikafest. But it's basically just an open invitation to design something in Troika, look at what other people are making. Troika's a really fun system to design in if you've never done anything else, because it's incredibly narrative. But also next week from the 5th through the 11th, where you've got Troikafest going on, which is a week of just inviting the RPG community to try out Troika for the first time, or just once again. They've got the Academies of the Arcane Kickstarter that I think is launching today or soon. That'll be a part of that, but also so we'll be playing that on Monday. We've got an interview with Daniel Sell just like this on Tuesday. We've got live streams throughout the course of the week, as well as open games. You can find out more about all that by following this channel, or if you go to Troikafest or ttrpg.link/tf invite, then you can see my invitation video, which has a whole list of links for all the different stuff that's happening. But now back to this actual conversation. Yeah. That kind of iterative design process is something that I'm like a huge fan of, and things where you're like, okay, we're just finding out what's happening. And even the world being a little bit loose until you give it shape, is something that I love in a game. And like the House Always Wins does that, but it's not your first game. You've actually designed a few different games. So tell me about some of the designs that led up to the House Always Wins.
So there's a lot of like unfinished scraps of paper and stuff in drawers, but the first thing that I ever like properly released, the first time I just sort of went, okay, let's do it and let's hope people like it, was a little 2-page RPG called Whiz Nerds, which is essentially like a kind of Harry Potter parody, although it's, you know, it doesn't hate trans people, but it's very like a sort of it's very much like a sort of you know, like a game that exists specifically to explore one mechanic, and that mechanic is every single character that is playing in this sort of scenario is a like wizard student who has just turned up on their first day of wizard school, and they haven't actually learned anything yet. So they've got all of the like textbooks that they need to go, but they haven't actually learned what's happening, and then they're thrust in a position where they need to save the day. So the way that works mechanically is you get this big list of like gobbledygook words, just like nonsense words, like, you know, like you would have like alakazam or pyro or whatever, where you don't necessarily get the meaning from them. You can make them a little bit sort of suggestive of what they're supposed to be, but they're essentially just sort of illegible to you as a player. But they exist in 3 columns. You say a word from each column, and that becomes a spell. So you physically have to say, you know, X, Y, Z. I probably should have got the sheet up so I could remember what the words were. But you know, you have to read out a spell, like you would, you know, doing Alaka Wazagazam or whatever. But then for the GM, they've got that translation list, so they sort of like cross-reference the two, and they get actual words. So the first one, for example, is like an element, so it might be like fire, or it might be physical, or it might be you know, something a little bit more like rage or charm. Then you've got like a target, so it might be, you know, where you're pointing, or where you're standing, or all around you in a cone, or every single friendly person around you. And then you've got like a sort of shape, so that might be like a wave or a ball or a cube or something like that. And then the GM just kind of like looks at those actual plain text words and just invents a spell in their head on the spot. And then as long as they sort of are consistent with that, and sometimes it's a lot to remember, but as long as they are consistent, the players can then do a spell and try and work out the words through action and reaction. So they're like, oh, okay, so when we did that, something set on fire. So one of these words means fire.
Right.
But like when we did this, it was like an ice spell, but it made it into a cube shape. So maybe this is how you make a block of ice. And it's all very much left to the interpretation of the GMs. There's no like sort of de jure spell that you can cast, but it's kind of implied in the words that you get. And I think a lot of people will see the same 3 words and maybe interpret them a little bit differently, which is quite fun. So you can technically play it with different GMs and not be completely you know, in the clear of what word's going to mean which. And you can position change and all that kind of stuff. Right. But it's a lot of fun. It's very slapstick. It's definitely a comedy RPG.
That's awesome. No, I love that. And I love, like, I every game that I design, it's like the 2 to 4 page beta is what I design first. Like, can I fit this game on 2 to 4 pages? And if I can't, I will probably never finish this game under my own power, and so I should move on to something else. And so, but I also love games that just stay at that level also too, right? Like that stay at the, hey, like it's the simple premise. I also love like magic system as games. There's a system this last Zine Quest called, I think it was called Power Words, that I backed at a pretty high level because it was just a very cool like magic system. And I messaged them and I was like, this should just be the game. Like, I don't like, you made it so you can just plug it into other things to make better magic systems. That's great. I just want to play this. Like, do you have a way to just play this game? But no, I love that idea. And so you've got that, and then you've got, another game called Would You Search Through the Lonely Earth for Me, right? What's that game about?
So this is very much like, it was at a time when I was sort of discovering solo RPGs for the first time. And I was just like, oh, I'd love to just make one of those, just sort of, it was very much like a sort of a time where I could just sort of sit down and be like, I want to explore this thing that I've just been sort of brought in on, and want to explore what that means, what that looks like. So I ended up writing this with a friend of mine called Zoe. It's based on a lyric from her favorite song. And it's a solo journaling RPG, but instead of playing a person, you're playing as an object. So you're like a precious treasure. A lot of my images appear to have broken on that website, by the way, but that's fine. So yeah, you're playing as like a precious treasure, or like an artifact or an heirloom or something like that. And you're kind of, instead of being a character, you're passed from character to character, and experiencing the world in a new place. So it's kind of that idea of, what does it feel like to be left in like a treasure vault for 1,000 years and then emerge when a civil war happens and you get picked up by a pauper? And is it like a more pleasant thing to be loved and adored by someone in a small hovel, or is it better to be completely untouched but seen by thousands of people in some massive museum or something like that? You'll pass through those different spaces and just sort of reflect. Like, it's a very sort of meditative experience, I think. It's very much like a deep time game, like, as well. You can go for like millennia in between each journal entry, it wasn't something that I'd necessarily seen. I'm sure somebody else has done it, but it was something that I wanted to explore.
Yeah, it's got some touchstones of like Artifact that like Jack from Mousehole Press did, but it sounds like there's a little bit more of the reflective quality on how do you feel about your experiences, more so on what are your experiences, and then telling that kind of overarching meta story of how you go from existent to destroyed as a creation, and more about what is it just like to be in these different states. And so that's very cool.
It's like a little bit of like a question I had. Every single game you make is like a what if moment. So it was very much like, I played so many RPGs where everything is defined by the actions that you take in the world. So I was like, what does an RPG look if you can't act? Like, if you are an inanimate object, like what does that mean for a player? So that was very much like what I was exploring when I was just sort of putting that together with Zoe.
Awesome. Well, let's talk a little bit about The House Doesn't Always Win. For people who maybe didn't follow the Kickstarter or aren't familiar with it, give us the elevator pitch of what The House Doesn't Always Win is all about.
Okay, so this is very much a game about playing cards and gambling, and like that kind of casino style game of like pushing your luck and seeing if you can come out on top. But it's wrapped in a story of like social change and revolution, and like punching above your weight and hoping for the best in like a world where the odds are just completely against you. So I've sort of positioned like the main antagonist, the diamonds. They are literally part of the deck, right? So, the diamond cards are like your targets. So the Jack, Queen, and King, they're the people that you're trying to take down. They're like the heads of the group that oppress you. And every sort of like number card underneath them is like one of those weak points that you might be able to expose. But then the rest of that deck is you. Like, you are, the 99%. You are the clubs, the hearts, the spades, who are just regular people who wish that the world was a little different. It's a game that is setting agnostic, so it can be played as medieval peasants revolting against a king. It can be played as like space truckers who are trying to unionize against a massive corporation. There's even a scenario in there written by Johnny, which is literally trying to attack and dethrone God, which is like, it's very much like a sort of, it can be played in a setting. But one of the fun things about it as well is that it's not always a story about good people. So, just because you're trying to oust the top like sort of the food chain in your society doesn't mean that you're doing it for good reasons. So you can equally play, one of the scenarios I've written is, you're mobsters who are trying to take down the head honcho family to try and get your slice of the pie kind of thing. But at the same time, it can be used for like those classic stories of just trying to right wrongs and get rid of some of the horrible systems in the world, and seeing what happens when you try that, and what happens if it doesn't go right, and what happens if it does.
So tell me a little bit about what the question was you were asking with this game that you kind of started designing it around.
Yeah, so I think mechanically the question was, I wanted to make a game with playing cards, right? I was always sort of fascinated by playing cards as a tool, because one of the things that really frustrates me about dice-based systems is how instant the result of your actions are. So like to take D&D as the sort of classic example, I want to do this big epic action, right? I'm sort of like charging into battle and trying to finally cut down the big bad that we've been trying to attack for this entire campaign, and he's on his last leg, and if I can just get this hit in, I might save the world. And then you roll the dice and it's either yes or no, and it's just sort of like, okay, there you go, like either you killed him or you didn't, and then that's it. And it's just like there's so much sort of disconnect by the standards of what you're actually trying to achieve in the story, and then what is actually happening mechanically. And I've always been a big proponent of, like, I always think that the mechanics should be married to the story that you're trying to tell. There shouldn't just be, okay, here's the cool setting that I like, and then I've just sort of grabbed a system that I know how it works and put it underneath. Whilst you can get some good games out of that, I think that always my favorite things I've ever played have been where every single aspect of the design is all working towards that one common goal, and trying to tell that one story, whether it's in the way that the dice work, or in the way that the world is formed, or the characters you can play, or the fact that my cat is trying to assault me right now. Get down. But yeah, it's so with the House Doesn't Always Win, it was a question of, how do I expand those sort of like dice rolls? How do I make these more interesting? So that was like the first sort of question that I was solving. It then sort of started as, because it iterates, right, as it always does. So
right.
It started with, oh, okay, so what if you draw cards from the deck and you're looking for a certain suit, right? So very like early on, it was like, okay, clubs. That sounds like a very sort of like, I'm going to smack someone over the head kind of action, right? I'm going to club someone. So it was like, okay, right, I want to knock someone out. I'm going to try and draw clubs. So then it was like, okay, well, how does that work? Because, it's just a straight 1 in 3 chance every time. So in that case, it was like, okay, so I'm trying to draw a certain amount of this suit. And then it was a case of what happens when you succeed or fail. So instead of it just being, I succeed and this happens, and I fail and this happens, suddenly, if you fail an action, those cards that you drew get taken out of the deck, and then the odds change, and everything sort of started building on top of each other. But that central question was always, how do we make these moments as interesting mechanically as they are narratively? So the way that sort of has come out at the other end of like the sausage factory of this game design is that we're at a point now where, so when you make any kind of sort of like challenge role that you would in an RPG, but in the House Doesn't Always Win, you're drawing cards from a deck. You're looking for a certain number of cards of a certain suit. So let's say that you're trying. Okay, come on then. He's going to come up now.
Yeah.
Let's say that you're trying to sneak past a guard or something like that, and you decide to use spades as your action. They're very sort of like lithe and acrobatic and stealthy and all that kind of thing.
And by the way, clandestine is pronounced clandestine in the US as well as in the UK. Yeah. Just for Jeremy Gage out there, if you're listening later.
He's been called out already. My God. But yeah, it's an action where you're trying not to be seen, right? So you draw those cards, and there's basically 3 states that you can end up in at the end of the draw. Either you succeed because you drew 3 spade cards, which you were looking for. You fail because you drew more cards that you weren't looking for, in this case 4. So say that you drew 4 hearts, or a mix of hearts and spades. If you drew that before you drew the 3 that you're looking for, you fail. And in that case, not only does the thing that you were trying to happen, the opposite occurs. So you were trying to sneak, but you got caught out or anything like that. But also those cards that you did draw, as I said earlier, they get taken out of the deck. So suddenly those odds for the rest of the game have just completely shifted.
Wow. So
And that can
almost the worst scenario is
exactly.
drawing almost as many cards as you need and then
Yeah.
not succeeding.
Yeah. It's like it's that crushing moment of so close, but
Right.
then it all fell apart, right?
It's awesome.
And you'll see how those kind of little stories can start to come out of it. And that was kind of the thing that I've been chasing for this game design. So then the third state is you can fold. So this is a game about gambling, right? So it's very much a case of, let's say that, okay, you were trying to sneak past the guards, right? And every single little card that you're drawing is kind of telling a story. So let's say that you drew the first card. Okay, good. You got a spade, right? You slip into the shadows and people don't know where you are, and you're starting to prepare to move through the corridors where the guards are sort of like patrolling or whatever it is that you're trying to get past them to get to. And then you draw a club, and it's like, oh, you just knock something over, and there's that echo of a pin drop, and the guards just sort of raise their eyebrows, but they're not looking around. You draw another heart, and you're like, oh god, this is getting close. And then you keep drawing, and every card that you're drawing with that individual sort of like miniature success or failure. Just show your buttholes to the camera. Thanks, Toto. Every sort of miniature success or failure is telling that little story itself. But there's always that moment of, well, I could just pull out. So you might get to, say, 3 cards that don't match the spades you're looking for, and you think, this is getting too rich for my blood. Like, this is not going to go my way. And at that point, you can decide to fold. So when you fold, it's kind of like, instead of a partial success, it's a partial failure. So the worst case scenario doesn't happen. You have a chance to save all your cards. Any face cards like a jack, a queen, or a king, which in this case are critical successes and can be lost permanently if lost, they are always safe in the case of a fold. So it's always the safe bet. But it's that thing of, you'll lose some cards and you will be put in a worse position. So there's always that question halfway through an action of, do I push on and risk it and potentially lose everything, but also potentially gain everything? And there's always that kind of like tension just sort of sitting over every action that you're doing. The way that sort of works in the story is that, that fold is almost like a tarot deck reading for the GM. So instead of it just being a case of, now it's, well, yeah, it was a partial success or a partial failure or a failure or a success or whatever it is, but suddenly you've got like this web of elements that happened in between those moments of your action. So it wasn't just, I tried to sneak past the guards and I knocked something over and they saw me. It was, I tried to sneak past the guards and then I got just to the place where I needed to be. And then as I was grabbing maybe a lockpick from my bag, it fumbled and fell on the floor. They turned around and I slipped back into the shadows and had to run back to the group. Suddenly those dice rolls of, you did a thing, you didn't do a thing, become like almost miniature stories in themselves. And they're kind of being told every time you're drawing those cards. And you can get that element of knowing what's coming with your action and knowing what's about to happen without actually knowing the result. So it's almost that case of, I mean, we talked about Jeremy Gage. I was on this podcast the other week and we were talking about Aegon, assisted by John Harper and Sean Nittner, which is very, very good. And the way it works is you basically have, oh my God, this cat, I swear. He only does this when I'm doing something important, don't you? So yeah, it's a system in which you have like your standard dice rolls. You build up a dice pool, you roll them, and then everyone has a result. And that's either a success or a failure. But the interesting thing about Aegon is that everyone sees their results before they say what they do. So you get a chance to, instead of just being like, I'm going to do something really heroic and then I fall flat on my face, which you have with that kind of, here's what I'm doing, I roll the dice, it didn't happen. Instead, it's, okay, well, here's what I'd like to do. I'm going to roll the dice. Then I see what is actually happening, and then I tell the story. So suddenly you combine together, you get that almost GM moment where you get to know the result ahead of time. So you get to tell a more interesting story. You get to tell a more interesting version of the events. And that was something that I think I ended up playing that after I was already designing the system. I was like, yes, no, that is exactly what I'm looking for. That kind of that sort of like tool to the players and the GM to know exactly what's coming. But the interesting thing with Theodore is that instead of knowing exactly what's coming, you have a hunch. So it's very much like you get that gut feeling of like, this is slipping away from me, or, this could just be the moment. And you also just get those wonderful things which you get with any kind of like push your luck game or anything like that, where you have those, just like you said, you have that moment where it looked like you were about to succeed and then everything just collapsed. but you also have those moments where you just got everyone around the table staring at you going, do not draw another card. You are going to screw us to draw another card. Then they do, and they crit success, and the whole room just erupts. And it's just like it's a super dramatic way of telling those actions and those like miniature stories within a story. And it's the thing that I'm most proud about of the design, I think.
Yeah. It also brings, I feel like, in an interesting like player skill level. Like there is a level of saying like, if nothing else, it might just be guts. Like, am I willing to pull that next card? Am I willing to steel myself and make that choice? Which a die roll doesn't have. Eventually, you just have to roll a die, and it's either going to happen or it's not. It's a luck based piece. But then there's also the ability to like, okay, like I can mathematically do a little bit of probability work based on what I know has or has not come out here. There is a strong level of the inability to say, hey, we're gonna develop a player skill here and you can get better at playing The House Doesn't Always Win. Whereas it's in a way that's not just about memorizing rules, right? In a way that actually lets you develop a tangible skill. And I love that in games. Like I love seeing the ability to say, okay, what did we give the players a little bit of agency over that lets them get better at this if they want to. There are a few games that I've designed, but I also know like some other people design where it's like, I could see myself doing prep work as a player to understand this game better and then be better at the actual narrative part of the game if I want to play in a way that doesn't imply cheating as long as you're not in a casino, right? And so
the other fun thing about that, and actually as a sort of a thing that I've already shown off, so this we can absolutely show off. If you go into the doc for the book, let's have a look at some of the playbooks. Because not only are they really, really beautiful, because the art from Lilith Buglerian and the wonderful design from Tom as well really, really sells them.
Let me adjust a little positioning on the screen so that people get a slightly better view of the book and a slightly less view of the chat bar on the bottom of Google Docs.
Hold on, let me just find the page number for you.
There we go. What page?
So we are looking at page 56.
56?
Yeah, or if you're typing it into thing, it'll be 30, I think.
Oh, 30? Oh, because it spreads?
Yeah, it spreads.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, so with the playbooks, these are very much...
And by the way, the art on this, like, that was another thing that made me instantly back this, is the art on this game is phenomenal. Like
absolutely wonderful. So funny story, these actual sort of portraits of the, so there's three sort of playbooks, but they are very so they're, instead of it just being like, here is a playbook and it always plays the same way, they're very customizable. So whilst there is only three playbooks, they're kind of like character themes rather than they are characters to play as. So they're kind of infinitely customizable, and with the different suit systems. So whilst you can play as the Jack, but are you the Jack of clubs? Are you the Jack of hearts? Are you the Jack of spades? That not only informs how good you are at certain actions, but also you get that individual trait that is only for your character kind of thing, right, which is quite cool. But if we look at some of the skills, and they are on their side, which might make it a little bit tricky, but you'll see they're not just sort of narrative driven skills. There's loads of skills that actually mess with the mechanics of the game as well. Not just in a way of like, oh, you get +2 to this or you get -1 to this, but it actually physically introduces new ways of messing with the deck. So for example, the king, which is the sort of yellow character, you'll see that they have a thing called cheating, and other characters have a sort of slight interaction with this, but the king is sort of like the specialist of it. So let's say that you so for example, you've got consolation prize here as one of the abilities for the king. So let's say that you failed at one of your actions. Well, as the king, you can cheat. You can grab one of those cards that is about to be lost in the game and just sort of use that as your ace up your sleeve. So suddenly you've got that like card that you can use in a really, really vital situation. So let's say that you pick up, like, I don't know, the 4 of clubs, and you're trying a clubs action later in the game, and you're on the edge of either failing or succeeding. You can just play that club straight away from your hand and immediately grab the result you need. And that's a very sort of like powerful thing in the mechanics, but also it's like, it's very easy to see what that means in a narrative context, because it's like, you've got that one trick up your sleeve that you've been saving right for this exact scenario. Like you've had that sort of mastermind moment of, don't worry, I've prepared for this. And it's not a case of, it's not like a Blades in the Dark flashback where it's like, okay, I'm gonna sort of retcon, and it's not a case of, oh, let's try and explain what has happened. It's it was something that you had in the bank but hadn't sort of assigned a story value to yet. So it's something that you can be like, okay, cool, here's where I'm going to pull out this thing that I've actually been holding, like here's a physical object that I've been holding in my hand just for this very occasion.
Right.
And then sort of like bring that into the narrative itself, which is very, very fun.
That's awesome. I love it. Yeah. And people, like, it was really funny. Like, Gil RPGs said, this game is so great, injected into my veins. Valerie North saw you do a let's play of this, They Forget Where. The unfolding story element was a definite win. And then the art, everybody just popped off for the art on this. Which I know representation was important for you both in contributors as well as art. Tell me a little bit about that, just because I think it's important for people to hear.
Yeah, no. So I will shout out to
Adira
Slattery. Yeah, sorry, my brain just blanked there. Adira Slattery, who is a fantastic game designer, actually inspired me to write that Journaling RPG after playing her and Fenn's The Machine.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a point where I was very much, when I was making this, I felt very much like a newbie in the space. Like, even though I had like my Dicebreaker sort of link as an actual designer, I was like, no one wants to talk to me. They're all just gonna say,
I did a 2-page RPG and a small solo RPG.
Who are you? Get out of my DM. So I was very kind of worried about reaching out to designers I didn't know. And I wanted to make sure that, because this is a story about, social change and revolution. It's like, it feels very much like an irresponsible thing for that to be a completely white project. And by the way, this is a in progress book, so you'll see some.
No, yeah. Anybody who's watching, these are an advanced version of the rules. I wanted people to get a little bit more sense. The art and the layout is just tremendous, and so I just want people to get a little bit of a sense.
Massive shout out to all of the visual aspects of the book from the designers and all the artists. So I think you should probably start